And so, the message finally came. It was simple. Almost too simple. Just a few words on a screen that had once felt impossible to imagine. Hey. I know this is unexpected. But I've been thinking about you. For a moment. Everything stopped. The room around you remained the same. The light. The silence. The ordinary details of your day. But inside, something shifted. Not because you had been waiting. Not because you were still the same person who once would have answered immediately. But because some memories never disappear completely. They only wait for the right moment to reveal whether they still have power over you. You stared at the message. Then you set the phone down. Then you picked it up again. Then you breathed deeply and reminded yourself of everything you had survived. The late nights. The unanswered questions. The version of yourself that had once begged for closure. That person no longer existed. In their place stood someone calmer. Someone wiser. Someone who understood that a message was not the same thing as a transformation. Still. You replied. Not with desperation. Not with anger. Just honesty. I've been thinking too. Those 4 words opened a door neither of you had touched in years. At first, the conversation was careful. Polite. Fragile. Like 2 people walking across glass, afraid that one wrong step might shatter everything. They asked about your life. You asked about theirs. They spoke about the years that had passed. The mistakes they had made. The loneliness they had not admitted to anyone else. And slowly, the truth began to surface. They had not forgotten you. Not really. They had tried. They had distracted themselves. They had convinced themselves that distance would make the feelings fade. But feelings do not always obey logic. Sometimes they wait. Sometimes they grow quieter. Sometimes they return stronger than before. You listened. And while part of you wanted to believe every word, another part of you remained cautious. Because pain teaches the heart to ask better questions. Why now? Why after all this time? Why after silence became a habit? They did not have perfect answers. Only honesty. And for the first time, that honesty mattered more than charm ever had. Days passed. Then weeks. The conversation deepened. Not into promises. Not yet. But into understanding. They told you what they had learned. How leaving had not brought the freedom they expected. How success had not filled the emptiness. How every new beginning had carried the shadow of something unfinished. And you. You told them what healing had cost. How you had rebuilt yourself piece by piece. How you had learned to trust your own strength. How you had stopped waiting for someone else to rescue you from the life you were creating. That was when they realized something painful. You were no longer the same person they had left behind. You were more grounded now. More self-aware. More difficult to impress. And strangely, that made them respect you even more. Because real love does not survive on memory alone. It survives when 2 people meet each other again as who they truly are now. Not as who they were. Not as who they wished they had been. But as the people time had shaped them into. Eventually, they asked to see you. Not in a dramatic way. Not with grand declarations. Just a quiet request. A chance to sit across from you and speak without screens between you. You agreed. But not because you had forgiven everything. You agreed because you wanted the truth to stand in the open. The meeting was not what either of you expected. There were no cinematic moments. No sudden embrace. No perfect speech that erased the past. Instead, there was silence. Then nervous laughter. Then the awkward realization that both of you had changed in ways that could not be undone. They looked at you with a kind of tenderness that had once felt familiar. But now, it carried something else. Regret. Not the kind that asks for pity. The kind that arrives when someone finally understands the value of what they lost. They admitted they had been afraid. Afraid of choosing wrong. Afraid of being seen too clearly. Afraid that love would demand more than they believed they could give. And because of that fear, they had let something beautiful slip away. You did not interrupt. You let them finish. Then you spoke your truth. You told them that love is not only about feeling. It is also about presence. About consistency. About showing up when it matters. You told them that being missed is not the same as being cherished. And being remembered is not the same as being chosen. Those words landed heavily between you. Because they were true. And truth has a way of clearing away illusions. For a long moment, neither of you spoke. Then they asked the question that had been waiting in the room all along. Is it too late? You looked at them carefully. Not with cruelty. Not with hope. With clarity. Because clarity is what remains when fantasy is gone. And you understood something important in that moment. The answer was not simple. Some endings are permanent. Some returns are meaningful. Some people come back not to restart the past, but to reveal whether the future is even possible. So you told them the truth. It depends on whether you're here to repeat the same story, or write a different one. That was the real problem. Not whether they had returned. Not whether feelings still existed. But whether either of you could build something honest from the ruins of what had once been broken. Because love can survive distance. It can survive silence. It can even survive regret. But it cannot survive dishonesty. Not for long. And so, the next chapter did not begin with a promise. It began with patience. With boundaries. With difficult conversations. With proof. They had to show up consistently. They had to listen without defending themselves. They had to accept that trust would not return because they wanted it to. It would return only if they earned it. And you had to decide whether your heart still had room for them. Not the memory of them. Not the version you once imagined. The real person. The one standing in front of you now. That was the hardest part. Because sometimes, what we miss is not the person. It is the feeling they once gave us. The hope. The excitement. The dream of what could have been. But dreams are not enough. Not anymore. You had grown beyond that. And because you had grown, you were no longer willing to settle for uncertainty disguised as love. Weeks turned into months. The connection either deepened or dissolved. There was no middle ground left. And slowly, something changed. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But steadily. They became more consistent. More transparent. More willing to face uncomfortable truths. And you became more open. Not because you forgot the past. But because you no longer feared it as much. You had learned that healing does not mean erasing pain. It means refusing to let pain make every decision for you. One evening, as the sun faded and the world softened into quiet gold, they looked at you and said something you had waited years to hear. Not I miss you. Not I was wrong. Those were important. But not enough. They said, I understand now. And maybe that was the beginning of everything. Because understanding is where real change starts. Not in regret. Not in longing. But in the willingness to become someone worthy of the love they once took for granted. You did not answer immediately. You simply let the moment exist. Then you smiled. Not because everything was fixed. But because for the first time, the future no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a choice. And that was the difference. Not destiny. Not coincidence. Choice. Two people, standing at the edge of what had been lost, deciding whether they were brave enough to build something new. Something honest. Something real. Something that would not survive on memory alone. And as the night settled around you, you realized the problem had never been whether your soulmate would return. The real problem was whether both of you could become the kind of people who deserved the return. To be continued. Imagine this. Somewhere in the quiet moments between yesterday and tomorrow, someone who once changed your life is thinking about you again. Not because fate has forced them. Not because the stars suddenly aligned. But because time has a strange way of revealing the value of what was once taken for granted. Perhaps you have spent months, or even years, trying to forget. Trying to convince yourself that the story was over. You deleted the messages. You removed the photographs. You filled your days with work, responsibilities, and endless distractions. Yet every now and then, a memory appeared without warning. A familiar song. A place you once visited together. A scent carried by the evening wind. For just a moment, it felt as though the past had quietly returned. And then it disappeared again. Life continued. But something inside you remained unfinished. What if the same thing has been happening to them? What if they have also been haunted by memories they tried to bury? Not because they planned it. Not because someone told them to think about you. But because certain connections leave marks that time cannot easily erase. Still, this is not a story about destiny making every decision. It is a story about people. People who make mistakes. People who let fear speak louder than love. People who walk away from something valuable because they believe another road will bring greater happiness. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't. The person you once loved believed they had more time. More chances. More opportunities. They assumed that if life ever became difficult, they could always return. But life rarely waits for anyone. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Months became years. The distance between two hearts grew larger than either of them expected. And while they were searching for answers elsewhere, you were learning lessons they never saw. You discovered how to survive disappointment. How to rebuild your confidence. How to smile again without depending on another person's approval. It wasn't easy. There were nights when silence felt unbearable. There were mornings when getting out of bed required more courage than anyone around you realized. No one applauded your healing. No one celebrated the invisible battles you fought. Yet somehow, you kept moving. Little by little, you became stronger. Not perfect. Not fearless. Just stronger than you had ever been before. Meanwhile, the other person was living a very different story. At first, everything seemed exciting. Freedom. New experiences. New faces. New places. They convinced themselves they had made the right decision. But excitement fades. Novelty disappears. Eventually, every distraction becomes ordinary. That is when reality begins asking difficult questions. Questions that cannot be ignored forever. Were they truly happier? Did leaving solve the problems? Or simply create new ones? Why did every meaningful conversation remind them of someone they left behind? Why did every relationship feel incomplete? Why did every victory seem strangely empty? The answers were uncomfortable. Because deep inside, they realized something important. They had not walked away because love was absent. They had walked away because fear was stronger. Fear of commitment. Fear of vulnerability. Fear of making the wrong choice. Fear often disguises itself as confidence. It whispers, "You deserve something better. You'll always have another chance. You don't need anyone. But years later, those whispers become regrets. Not because the past can be changed, but because wisdom usually arrives after experience. One evening, without expecting it, your name crossed their mind. Then the next day, it happened again. Soon, they found themselves wondering questions they had ignored for years. How are you? Are you happy? Did you find someone else? Do you ever think about them anymore? Curiosity slowly became reflection. Reflection slowly became longing. Longing slowly became courage. For the first time in a long time, they considered reaching out. Not to erase the past. Not to pretend nothing happened. But simply to say, I've been thinking about you. At exactly the same time, your own life was beginning to change. You had stopped waiting. That was the difference. You were no longer watching every notification. You were no longer hoping every unknown phone call belonged to them. You had learned something priceless. Peace does not come from someone returning. Peace comes from accepting that your happiness cannot depend on another person's decision. Ironically, that inner peace changed everything. Because people often notice us most when we finally stop chasing them. Your confidence became visible. Your kindness remained intact despite everything you had experienced. Your heart became wiser, without becoming colder. And somewhere, the person who once left began realizing exactly what they had lost. But here, the story takes an unexpected turn. Because there is a problem. A very real problem. Returning is much easier than rebuilding trust. Memories may survive. Feelings may survive. Even hope may survive. But trust must be earned again. Every promise once broken creates questions that words alone cannot answer. If they return, will history repeat itself? If you forgive, will the same pain happen again? Can two people truly become different after years apart? Or are they simply remembering an idealized version of the past? These are not easy questions. And they deserve honest answers. Because love without honesty becomes illusion. As the days passed, the distance between you grew smaller. Not physically. Emotionally. Both of you were changing. Both of you were learning. Neither of you fully understood what was coming next. But one thing was certain. The next chapter would demand courage from both hearts. Not the courage to fall in love, but the courage to face the truth. And sometimes, the truth changes everything. To be continued. Winter slowly gave way to spring. The world around you began to bloom once again. Trees that had stood bare for months were covered in fresh leaves. Flowers opened quietly toward the morning sun. And somehow, your heart felt the same. Not because every wound had disappeared, but because healing had become stronger than pain. One afternoon, the two of you returned to the place where your story had first begun. Nothing about the place had changed. The same streets. The same quiet breeze. The same familiar sky. Yet everything felt different. Because the people standing there were no longer the same people. They turned toward you. Their voice was calm. I used to believe love was something that simply happened. Now I understand. Love is something we choose. Every single day. You smiled. Because years ago, those words would have sounded beautiful. Today, they sounded true. For a long moment, neither of you spoke. There was no need. Silence had become comfortable. Not because nothing needed to be said, but because trust had finally returned. Not all at once. Not magically. One honest conversation. One kept promise. One ordinary day at a time. As the evening sun painted the sky in shades of gold, they reached into their pocket. Not to offer a dramatic surprise. Not to erase the past. But to hand you something unexpected. It was a folded letter. Written by hand. I wanted you to read this. Even if you never answered. You slowly unfolded the paper. The first line read, "If I could speak to the person I was years ago, I wouldn't tell them how much success they would find. I would tell them not to walk away from the people who truly love them." You continued reading. Every paragraph spoke of growth. Of regret. Of lessons learned too late. But it never asked for pity. It never demanded forgiveness. It simply acknowledged the truth. When you finished, you looked at them. There were tears in both your eyes. Not tears of sadness, but tears that come when two people finally stop hiding from the truth. You folded the letter carefully. "I don't forgive you because you came back," you said softly. "I forgive you because neither of us is the same person anymore." Those words seemed to lift a weight neither of you had realized you were still carrying. The future stretched before you. Unknown. Unwritten. And that was perfectly okay. Because real love does not need certainty to exist. It only needs honesty. Weeks became months. Months became another year. Life continued with its ordinary challenges. Some days were joyful. Some were difficult. There were disagreements. Unexpected setbacks. Moments of doubt. But one thing had changed forever. Neither of you ran away anymore. You stayed. You listened. You chose understanding over pride. Again and again. One evening, while watching the sunset together, they quietly asked, "Do you think we're soulmates?" You laughed gently. Then answered, "I don't know. Maybe. Or maybe we are simply two imperfect people who finally learned how to love each other well." They smiled. And perhaps that's even better. The sky slowly darkened. The stars appeared one by one. And as you looked up, you realized something that had taken years to understand. The greatest gift was never someone's return. The greatest gift was becoming someone who could live with peace, whether they returned or not. Because happiness that depends entirely on another person will always feel fragile. But happiness built on self-respect, growth, faith, and hope can survive almost anything. Looking back, you no longer wished to erase the painful chapters. Without them, you would never have become who you are today. Every goodbye had taught you gratitude. Every mistake had taught you wisdom. Every tear had taught you compassion. And every new beginning had reminded you that life is always willing to offer another chance. To those who are willing to grow. As the two of you walked forward together, there were no guarantees. No perfect ending. Only a shared commitment. To choose kindness. To choose honesty. To choose each other. Every single day. Perhaps that is what true love has always been. Not destiny written in the stars. But two hearts. Growing through failure. Learning through forgiveness. And discovering that the strongest relationships are not the ones that never break, but the ones rebuilt with truth, patience, and unwavering respect. And so, your story did not end with the words, "They lived happily ever after." It ended with something far more meaningful. They woke up each morning, looked at one another, and chose love again. Because in the end, the greatest soulmate is not the one who never leaves. It is the one who returns wiser, stays with honesty, and helps you become the best version of yourself. The end. Months quietly passed. Life settled into a rhythm that neither of you had expected. The excitement of reunion had faded. And something far more valuable had taken its place. Peace. For the first time. You weren't wondering whether they would leave again. And they weren't trying to convince you to trust them. Trust was no longer being discussed. It was being lived. Every small promise they made, they kept. Every difficult conversation, they faced without running. Every misunderstanding became another opportunity to understand each other instead of pulling apart. One rainy afternoon, the two of you sat together at a quiet cafe. Outside, people hurried through the streets with umbrellas. Inside, time seemed to slow. They smiled and asked, "Do you ever wish we had never been separated?" You thought about the question for a long time. Then you answered softly. "Years ago, I would have said yes. But today, I think we needed that distance. Not because the pain was good, but because we were not ready for the kind of love we wanted." They lowered their eyes. For a moment, regret filled the silence. "I spent years blaming circumstances," they admitted. "I blamed timing, distance, work, family, everything except myself." You listened quietly. They continued. "The truth is, I was afraid. Afraid of loving someone enough to risk losing them. So I convinced myself that walking away would protect me. Instead, it only taught me what real loneliness feels like." A gentle breeze drifted through the open cafe window. The rain outside slowly stopped. People began returning to the streets. Life continued. Just as it always does. And somehow, that ordinary moment felt more meaningful than any dramatic reunion could have been. Weeks later, you took a walk through a familiar park. The same park where years ago, you had once imagined a future together. Back then, the future had seemed simple. Now, it seemed wiser. Not because you knew what would happen, but because you had stopped trying to control everything. As you walked, they reached for your hand. Not confidently. Not assuming you would accept. Simply offering it. You looked down. Then gently took it. Neither of you spoke. Sometimes, healing doesn't arrive with a speech. Sometimes, it arrives with a simple gesture. As autumn slowly turned into winter, your relationship continued to grow. Not through excitement, but through consistency. Birthdays were remembered. Promises were kept. Difficult conversations were no longer avoided. Each small act quietly answered the question that words never could. People really can change, if they are willing to. One evening, you asked them something they had never expected. "If I had never replied to your message, what would you have done?" They smiled sadly. "I would have understood. Because forgiveness is a gift, not a debt." Those words stayed with you. Because they came from humility, not desperation. That night, as you looked up at the stars, you realized something beautiful. You no longer feared the future. Whether this relationship lasted forever, or only for another season. You knew one thing for certain. You would never lose yourself again. That lesson was worth every tear you had cried. Months later, they looked at you and quietly said, "Thank you. Not for giving me another chance, but for inspiring me to become someone better than I used to be." You smiled. Because at last, you understood. This story had never truly been about finding a soulmate. It had been about two imperfect people learning that love is not built on destiny alone. It is built on honesty, responsibility, patience, forgiveness, and the daily choice to never stop growing. The journey was far from over. But for the first time, You were no longer afraid of the next chapter. Because whatever happened next, you had already become the person you were meant to be. To be continued. The weeks that followed were unlike anything either of you had imagined. There were no dramatic declarations. No promises whispered beneath the stars. No guarantee that everything would work out. Instead, there were ordinary days. Simple conversations. Small moments that slowly revealed the truth. Because real love is not proven in extraordinary moments. It is proven in ordinary ones. They called when they said they would. They listened without interrupting. They apologized without making excuses. And little by little, the walls around your heart became lower. Not because they disappeared, but because they no longer felt necessary all the time. Still, fear remained. Some nights, you wondered if trusting again was a mistake. You remembered every tear, every sleepless night, every unanswered message. You asked yourself, what if history repeats itself? What if this is only temporary? What if I open my heart, only to watch it break again? Those questions deserved honest answers. So instead of hiding them, you spoke them aloud. For the first time, your conversations were not about the past. They were about the future. Not the future you imagined years ago. The future you could build now. Together. If both of you were willing. One evening, they looked at you and said quietly, I don't expect you to trust me because of what I say. I only hope that one day you'll trust me because of what I consistently do. Those words stayed with you. Because they asked for nothing. They demanded nothing. They simply accepted that trust cannot be rushed. Months passed. The seasons changed. The person standing beside you was no longer trying to impress you. They were simply trying to become better. And perhaps that was the greatest difference of all. One morning, as you watched the sunrise together, you realized something surprising. You were no longer afraid of losing them. Not because you believed they would never leave, but because you had finally learned that your happiness no longer depended on another person's choices. You had become whole on your own. Which meant, if love remained, it would be a gift, not a necessity. That realization changed everything. Because healthy love is not built on fear of abandonment. It is built on freedom. Freedom to stay. Freedom to leave. Freedom to choose each other. Again and again. Then came the moment neither of you could avoid. They asked, do you think we can truly begin again? You smiled gently. And answered with complete honesty. We cannot begin again. The past happened. We cannot erase it. But we can begin something new. Silence filled the space between you. Not an uncomfortable silence. A peaceful one. The kind that exists when two people finally understand each other. You both looked back at everything that had happened. The mistakes. The distance. The heartbreak. The growth. And suddenly, none of it felt meaningless anymore. Every painful chapter had prepared you for this one. Not because suffering is beautiful, but because healing had taught both of you how to love differently. More patiently. More honestly. More intentionally. Life did not suddenly become perfect. There were still disagreements. There were still difficult days. But now, neither of you ran away. You stayed. You talked. You listened. You chose understanding over pride. And perhaps, that is what maturity looks like. Not never making mistakes, but refusing to let those mistakes become permanent. As another year passed, you realized the title of this story had never been completely accurate. Yes. Your soulmate had returned. But the real miracle was not their return. It was your transformation. Because if they had returned years earlier, the story would have ended exactly as before. Only after both of you had changed. Did love finally have a chance to grow? And maybe that is the lesson hidden inside every meaningful relationship. People often pray for someone to come back. But sometimes, the greater gift is becoming the kind of person who no longer needs someone to complete them. When two whole people meet, love becomes stronger. Not because it fills an emptiness, but because it becomes a choice made freely. As you walked forward together, you understood one final truth. The greatest love stories are not about perfect people. They are about imperfect people who choose honesty over illusion, growth over comfort, forgiveness over resentment, and commitment over fear. The journey had not been easy. But perhaps that was exactly why it mattered. Because anything worth keeping usually asks us to become better before we can truly receive it. The future remained unwritten. No one could promise forever. No one could predict tomorrow. But both of you had learned something priceless. Love is not found. Love is built. One honest choice. One faithful step. One ordinary day at a time. The end.